The morning Nina decided she was done being afraid, the sky above Solon village was the color of a bruise, that particular purple-gray that comes just before dawn breaks or just before a storm does, and she had long since stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. 3 years of drought had made the paddies look like old skin. They cracked in long, jagged lines from the edge of the village road all the way down to the dry riverbed, and in the early mornings when Nina walked to the well, she could hear the cracking as the earth contracted in the cool air. It was a sound she hated. It sounded like something giving up. She had 2 people left who depended on her, her younger sister Lee and Lee's daughter, a 5-year-old girl everyone called Bomi, who had their grandmother's eyes and their father's laugh, and who had, in the past 3 years, eaten considerably less than she should have. Nina did not let herself think too directly about this. She thought about it sideways, about which meals she could skip without anyone noticing, about which neighbors still had grain they might share for a day's help in their kitchen, about how to tell Bomi that the meal in her bowl was enough when it wasn't. She was very good at thinking sideways. It was, she had come to understand, the primary skill of poverty. The morning the stranger arrived at the village gate, Nina was hauling water back from the well with Bomi strapped to her back, because Lee had woken with a fever and Nina had sent her back to bed before she could argue. Bomi was singing something tuneless and patting the back of Nina's head with both hands, which Nina did not mind. The child's warmth against her back was one of the things she held on to when she thought too directly about the state of the grain stores. The stranger was standing at the gate talking to old Mr. Han, who managed the village entrance with a combination of total authority and complete ineffectiveness that characterized every role he held. He was younger than Nina had expected from the way Mr. Han was behaving. Young men of importance did not usually come to Solon, so when they did, Mr. Han tended to overcorrect. The stranger wore the plain grey traveling coat of a merchant, but it was well-made grey, and his posture was the posture of a man who had spent some time among people who expected posture from him. He had a case of documents under one arm and was listening to Mr. Han with the patient expression of someone who was genuinely listening and not just waiting for the other person to finish. Nina stopped a few feet away and set down the water bucket. "Who are you?" she said, "and what do you want from us?" He turned. He had a direct way of looking at people, like he was actually trying to see them rather than just making eye contact as a social formality. His name, he said, was Jason Kwon, and he was here on behalf of a ceramics company based in the capital. They were sourcing high-grade porcelain clay. He had reason to believe it existed in this region, in the grey layer below the topsoil, and he was prepared to exchange grain, good grain, measured fairly, for clay that met his company's specification. Nina listened to all of this without changing her expression. When he finished, she said, "You want to dig up our land. The clay sits 3 feet below your farming layer. Removing it doesn't affect what grows above." He held out the document case. "I have a trade permit from the Bureau of Commerce and a sample contract. I would ask only that your village elder review every clause before anyone agrees to anything. I won't begin work until he's satisfied." She looked at the document case, then at him. "Where are you actually from? Not your company, you." Something shifted in his expression, mild surprise she thought that she was asking. "Yeonnam Province, originally, south. Long way from home." "I've been in the capital 5 years. It stops feeling like a long way after a while." He paused. "The permit is genuine. The contract terms are fair. I understand if you want time to verify both before you decide anything." "I'll take it to Elder Cho," she said. "Come back this afternoon." She took the document case and walked home without looking back. Bomi, still on her back, craned around to watch the stranger and said, "He has nice shoes," which Nina thought was probably true, but not the most relevant observation. Elder Cho read the contract 3 times, which was his standard procedure for anything that could affect the village, and then he read the permit twice and the supporting correspondence once, and finally sat back in his chair and looked at Nina over the edge of his spectacles. "It's legitimate," he said, in a tone that suggested he had been hopping to find a reason to say otherwise. "The terms, Fair, actually more than fair. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them. 20 pounds of clay for 1 pound of grain. At current famine prices, that's below market rate for the clay and above market rate for the grain. He's giving us the better end of it. Nina thought about this. In her experience, people who gave you the better end of things did it for a reason, and the reason was never simple generosity. It was leverage or reputation or something they needed from you that wasn't in the contract. She filed this alongside everything else she didn't yet understand about Jason Kwan and told the elder they would try it. The operation started the following Monday. Jason set up the exchange station in the communal hall, a weighing scale, a ledger, a tin box for the grain tokens he distributed to each family upon verified delivery. He ran it methodically and without fuss, rising before most of the village and staying later than most of the village. And Nina, who had appointed herself the unofficial supervisor of the entire arrangement without anyone formally asking her to, observed all of this and tried to determine whether she trusted him. She did not come to a conclusion quickly. Trust, in her experience, was something you arrived at the way you arrived at the far side of a river, not by deciding to cross it, but by finding, at some point, that you already had. What she noticed, he was consistent. He weighed the same at 7 in the morning as he did at 6 in the evening. He didn't give certain families better rates than others. He noticed things, the way Grandmother Park's hands shook when she carried her clay delivery and quietly began meeting her halfway, not making a scene of it. The way the Yoon boys, 12 and 14, were bringing twice as much clay as their father, and he gave the father full credit anyway, preserving the man's dignity in a year when it was already barely intact. She noticed that he ate with the village workers at lunch rather than apart, and she noticed, though she tried not to, because it was not the most important thing, that he laughed easily and that it looked good on him. The first real conversation they had that wasn't about clay or grain happened on the 9th day of the operation, when a thunderstorm kept everyone inside, and the exchange station was empty, and they were both reviewing the week's tallies because there was nothing else to do. "Bomi calls you the shoe man," Nina said, without looking up from the ledger. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a good name or a bad name?" "From Bomi, it's a compliment. She has strong opinions about footwear." Nina turned a page. "She told Lee you were probably a prince because only princes have shoes that shiny." "I'm not a prince. I'm from a family of rice merchants." "I know, I checked." She said it simply, not as an accusation. "You passed the first civil examination when you were 18. Your family expected you to continue. You went to the southern ports instead." "You're thorough," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, but was somewhere in between. "I have 2 people who depend on me. I'm always thorough." She set down her brush. "Why did you leave the examination path?" He looked at the rain on the window. "Because I was good at examinations, and I would have been a decent official, and decent felt like a waste. I went to the ports for what I thought was a month, and stayed for 2 years, because I discovered I was better at understanding how things actually moved in the world than I was at understanding how systems were supposed to work." He paused. "My father was very unhappy about it for a long time. And now the family house has a new roof, and my younger brother sat the examinations instead, and I think we've all decided that things worked out." Nina looked at him. "My father wanted the same thing. He was going to send my brother to study. My brother died of fever at 16. She said it evenly because she had learned that the only way to say hard things without breaking was to say them as facts. After that, my father never really recovered. When the drought came, there was nothing left." Jason didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated this more than she could have articulated. He just nodded, in the way of someone who was treating the information with respect rather than trying to resolve it. "So it's been you holding this together," he said. "Lee helps. Lee is warm and lovely, and everyone in the village adores her, but you're the one who came to the gate. You're the one who took the contract to Elder Cho." He said it without particular emphasis, just as an observation about where the weight had been sitting. You've been the decision-maker here for a long time." Nina didn't answer. The rain ran down the window glass in long diagonal lines. Somewhere in the village, a child was laughing, Bomi, probably, who treated thunderstorms as entertainment rather than inconvenience, and whom Lee had clearly failed to keep inside. "How long will this operation run?" Nina asked. "The contract allows for 8 weeks. After that, I assess whether the formation warrants an extended phase." He paused. "There's also a secondary formation on the eastern hillside that I haven't evaluated yet." She nodded and went back to the ledger. But she was aware, more than she wanted to be, of the quality of the silence between them, that it had become, at some point in the past 10 minutes, a different kind of silence than the one they'd started with. The trouble arrived in the 4th week, wearing the face of Park Mansu. Park Mansu owned 3/4 of the farmable land in the district. He was a broad man in his 50s who had the smooth surface of someone who had never needed to be rough, because he had always had enough people around him to be rough on his behalf. He arrived at the exchange station on a Tuesday morning with 2 of his land managers behind him and looked at the operation with the expression of a man watching water drain away from his reservoir. "The trade permit," he said to Jason, "requires a countersignature from the district magistrate. Without it, every transaction this station has conducted is in violation of provincial commerce law." Nina, who had been at the grain distribution table, crossed the room and stood beside Jason before he had time to respond. "The permit was issued by the Bureau of Commerce," she said. "That's a national body. It supersedes provincial countersignature requirements under the Reform Charter of." "That charter applies to capital city operations," Park Mansu said, "not rural districts. You're welcome to argue it with the magistrate." He left without waiting for a response. His land managers followed. The families who had been waiting at the exchange station watched this in complete silence. After they were gone, Jason said quietly to Nina, "You knew this was a possibility." "I suspected it when he stopped by the gate 2 weeks ago and spent too long looking at the operation without speaking to anyone," she said. "I sent a letter to Elder Cho's contact at the district office 3 days after that, asking them to clarify the countersignature requirement. We haven't heard back yet." He looked at her sideways. "You sent the letter 3 days after you suspected it. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't certain, and because if I told you and I was wrong, we would have spent 2 weeks in unnecessary tension with the village watching us." She met his eyes. "I told you when I was certain." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You manage information the way I manage inventory. You don't release it until you know its value." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, "it isn't." He turned back to the ledger. "I sent a rider to the capital 5 days ago, anticipating exactly this. He should be back by Thursday." This time it was Nina who was quiet. "You sent him 5 days ago." "I noticed Park Mansu, the gate 2 weeks ago also." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the grain distribution table without saying anything else, but there was something different about the set of her shoulders, something that might, from a certain angle, have looked like relief. The rider returned Thursday afternoon with the clarification document, which confirmed that the Bureau of Commerce permit was nationally valid and required no provincial countersignature. Park Mansu, when presented with the document the following day, read it 3 times and then folded it with the careful movements of a man who was deciding how much this mattered and in what direction to redirect his energy. He redirected it, as it turned out, toward the families who owed him grain debts. The Yoon family was the first. They had borrowed grain from Park Mansu 2 winters ago, at terms that seemed manageable then and were not manageable now. The interest had compounded, the drought had continued, and the repayment clause allowed Park Mansu to claim their property after 4 consecutive missed payments. They had missed 4. On a Sunday morning, his land managers appeared before dawn with a document and a handcart and began removing things from the family's storage room. Nina heard about it an hour later from the Yoon boys, who came to her door white-faced and out of breath. She went to the Yoon house immediately. Park Mansu's managers were still there, working through the list of claimable items with the methodical efficiency of people who did this regularly. "The debt contract," she said to the senior manager. "Show me the clause you're operating under." He showed her. She read it. It was airtight in the way of contracts written by people who have been writing exploitative contracts for generations and know exactly which words do the work. The property claim was valid. She went back to the exchange station and found Jason. "How many families in this village have debt contracts with Park Mansu?" he asked when she had finished explaining. "At least 16, probably more who won't say so." "Get me the contracts." He was already pulling a clean sheet of paper toward him. "All of them, if they'll share them. If 16 families present evidence together, it's not a private debt dispute, it's a systemic lending practice. The magistrate can rule on a systemic practice in ways he can't rule on an individual case." "That's a long process." "It is, but it's the one with the best outcome." He looked up at her. "The Yoon family, can they stay with someone in the village tonight?" "They can stay with us." He nodded. "Then let's start tonight." They went door to door for 3 evenings. Nina talked. Jason read the documents by lamplight and made notes in his precise, unhurried handwriting. He found the pattern, the same impossible interest structure repeated across all 16 contracts, slightly rephrased but functionally identical, a template designed to look like individual agreements but operating as a single system. He laid the 16 contracts side by side on the communal hall table and drew lines between the corresponding clauses until the architecture of it was visible even to people who had never read a legal document before. "He didn't write this himself," Jason said on the second evening. "Someone with legal training designed this. Probably the same person designed all the similar contracts in other villages in the district." Nina looked at the table of documents. "How many other villages?" "At least 3. I've seen variations of this structure in Murray Village and Deason during my regional survey." He paused. "Which means this isn't just Park Mansu, this is bigger." Nina sat down. She thought about the drought years, all the families who had borrowed grain in desperation, all the contracts signed without understanding what the language meant, all the land that had quietly changed hands while the village was too hungry and exhausted to look clearly at the documents. She thought about how much territory could be claimed by a patient man who understood that crisis makes people careless about paperwork. "What do we do?" she said. "We go to the magistrate with the 16 contracts, and before we go, I contact my company's legal correspondent in the capital and ask him to identify the specific statute under which these contracts violate the agricultural lending protections." He looked at her steadily. "It will take a week, but when we walk into that office, I want us to be right." "You're certain the statute exists?" "I'm certain because my mother's family lost their land to a contract like this when I was 14, he said, in the same even tone she had used to tell him about her brother. "I spent the next 3 years reading every piece of agricultural law I could find. I know the statute exists. I just need the exact citation." Nina looked at him, at the documents on the table, at his handwriting connecting the clauses in lines that made the invisible visible. "A week," she said. "A week." The Yoon family slept in Nina and Lee's front room. Bomi, delighted by the company, spent the first night wide awake asking the Yoon boys questions until Lee fell asleep on the floor trying to get her to settle, and Nina gave up entirely and let everyone just talk until they were tired enough to stop. By the second night, some kind of equilibrium had established itself. The Yoon boys, it turned out, were excellent at mending things, and by day 3 they had fixed the broken hinge on the storage door that Nina had been meaning to address for 6 months, which she felt was a fair trade for the sleeping arrangements. Lee, watching Nina update the clay tallies late one evening while Jason worked through legal documents at the other end of the table, leaned close to her sister and said, at a volume not entirely suitable for the proximity, "You like him." "He's a colleague," Nina said. "You've used that word 3 times this week. When you say it that many times, it usually means the opposite thing." Nina did not look up from the tallies. Go to sleep, Lee. I'm just saying, he's here every morning before everyone else, and he stays later than everyone, and he brought Bomi a wooden rabbit from the market yesterday, and you act like you haven't noticed any of this. Bomi told him her previous rabbit broke. He was being kind. He was being kind to Bomi because he wants you to trust him. Lee stood up and stretched. Which is working, by the way. You trust him. I can tell because you stopped checking whether the tallies match his ledger. Nina had, in fact, stopped checking this. She had noticed stopping. She hadn't decided what it meant yet. The letter from Jason's legal correspondent arrived on the 6th day. That evening, the two of them walked to the magistrate's office in the district town, 4 miles, along a road that had been dusty for 3 years and was still dusty, carrying 16 contracts, the legal correspondence, and a written testimony from each family that had agreed to sign their name to the petition. Magistrate Lee Sung-won was a man of 55 who had the look of someone who had been trying to do the right thing in difficult circumstances for long enough that the effort had become visible in his face. He read the documents. He read the correspondence. He read the 16 contracts laid out on his desk in the arrangement Jason had devised with the parallel clauses annotated. He was quiet for a very long time. The pattern is clear, he finally said. These contracts were designed by the same hand for the same purpose. He set down his spectacles. I want to know, how did you find the statute? Personal experience, Jason said. The magistrate looked at him for a moment, then nodded in the way of someone who understood what that meant and chose not to press it. I'll need 3 days to write the ruling properly. The Yoon family's property must be returned in the meantime. I can issue a temporary order today. He looked at Nina. The other 15 families will be protected from enforcement action during the review period. I want them to know that. I'll tell them tonight, Nina said. He stood, which meant the meeting was over, and then he paused. There was a man in my office last week, he said, asking about this village, about the clay operation, and about you. He looked between them. He identified himself as a traveling official from the capital. I had no reason to doubt him, but he asked very specific questions for a casual visit. Nina looked at Jason. Jason looked at the magistrate. What kind of questions? Jason said. About how the grain distribution was structured, whether it was reaching the people who most needed it, whether the village leadership was honest. The magistrate picked up his spectacles again. He seemed very interested in whether the system was working the way it was supposed to. They walked back to Solon village in the dark, the road silver with the light of a half-moon, their footsteps raising small clouds of white dust. A traveling official from the capital, Nina said. Asking whether systems work the way they're supposed to, Jason said. In a drought year, when disaster relief has been visibly failing for 3 seasons. They walked in silence for a while. An inspection tour, Nina said. Incognito, Jason said, if it's what I think it is. Then why hasn't he appeared? Because people behave differently when they know they're being watched. The whole point of an incognito tour is to see what actually exists rather than what people perform for inspection. Jason looked at the road ahead. If he's been watching the operation, he's seen what actually exists. Nina thought about the clay exchange, the grain tokens, the 16 contracts laid out on a table, the Yoon family's hinge repaired in her front room. Then he's seen enough to form a view, she said. Yes, Jason said, I think he has. The stranger came to the exchange station 6 days after the magistrate's ruling, on a morning when the air had the particular clarity of early autumn, when summer heat has finally relented and everything looks slightly more defined than it did before. He wore a plain coat and arrived without ceremony, accompanied by a single quiet aide named Daniel who took notes on everything. He looked around the exchange station with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who knew exactly what to look for and had been looking for it for some time. He drank the barley tea Nina offered and set the cup down and said, without preamble, the petition to the magistrate. 16 families presenting contracts as a collective body of evidence rather than as individual complaints. That was your approach. It was the right approach for the situation, Nina said. I'm not questioning whether it was right. I'm establishing who thought of it. He looked at her directly. She looked back. He had the posture and stillness of someone accustomed to very large rooms and a great deal of deference, and he was currently sitting in a village exchange station, drinking barley tea, and apparently finding this entirely acceptable. The drought has affected 47 villages in this district. 3 district magistrates have resigned this year. The relief grain allocated by the court has been reaching, by our best estimate, about 30% of the people it was intended for. He set down his teacup. What you have built here, the clay exchange, the distribution structure, the debt petition, addresses 3 separate failures of the system simultaneously, without waiting for the system to correct itself. The system wasn't correcting itself fast enough, Nina said. People were hungry now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his sleeve and placed something on the table. It was small and jade green and carved with a seal that Nina had never seen in person, only in stories, the kind of stories that turned out to be history. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the posture and the stillness and the way Daniel was writing down everything, but had not introduced himself with a title. She thought about the questions he had been asking around the district, systems, structures, whether things worked the way they were supposed to. She thought about how a king, if he wanted to see his country clearly, would have to take off everything that made him look like a king. She stood and bowed. Beside her, she heard Jason rise and do the same. "I apologize for the deception," said the king. "It was necessary." "It was sensible," Nina said, which made him look at her with an expression of mild, genuine surprise. "I came today," he said, "because the investigation is complete and because I want to offer you a position. In the capital, the Ministry of Revenue is rebuilding its grain relief administration from the structure level, which is the correct place to rebuild it, since the problem was never the intention, but the architecture." He looked at her steadily. "I need people who understand how resources actually move through communities, who know the difference between a system that looks right on paper and one that actually reaches people." A pause. "You are the clearest example of that understanding I have encountered in this investigation." Nina looked at the table, at the grain token system, at the clay ledger, at the handwriting she and Jason had spent weeks building together, at the small wooden rabbit on the corner of the shelf that Bomi had left behind when Lee came to visit. "I will need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he stood. Daniel closed his notebook. "I will return in 3 days. There is no pressure. Whatever you decide, what you have done here will be recorded." He left quietly, the way he had arrived. When the door closed, neither Nina nor Jason said anything for a while. It was Jason who spoke first. "You should go," he said. Not immediately, he said it carefully, the way he said things that cost him something. "If you want to go, it's the right work and you're the right person for it, and the scale of what you could address from the capital is..." He stopped. "I think you should go." "What about the clay operation?" "I can extend the contract through the harvest season. The Eastern Formation still needs assessment." He was looking at the ledger. "And my company's main correspondent office is in the capital." Nina looked at him. He was being very careful about the ledger. "Jason," she said. He looked up. "Say the actual thing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you to go," he said, "and I also think you should go, and I'm trying to figure out how to hold both of those at the same time." "Hold them by coming to the capital when the extended contract ends," she said. She said it simply, the way she said things that were true. "The Eastern Formation will take until spring. In spring, I will have been in the capital 6 months, and I will know whether the work is real and worth staying for. And you will have finished what you started here, and you will know what you want to do next, and we'll figure out the rest from there." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's very logical." "It's the right sequence," she said, "isn't it?" "Yes," he said, "it is." Lee cried when Nina told her, in the specific way Lee cried, generously and without embarrassment, with her whole face, and then recovering completely within about 4 minutes and becoming entirely practical. She helped Nina pack, organized a farewell dinner in the communal hall, made Nina promise to write every 2 weeks, and accept nothing less in return, and then, on the morning of departure, held her sister for a long time without saying anything, which was the thing she did when words felt insufficient. Bomi, who had been told that Nina was going to the city to do important work and would come back for the New Year festival, presented her with a small flat stone she had painted with an unidentifiable orange shape and told her very seriously that it was a tiger for protection. Nina put it in her traveling bag where she could reach it and carried it all the way to the capital. The city was vast in a way that Solon had not prepared her for. Not just the size, but the density of it, the way everything existed in layers, the wealthy districts above the merchant quarters, above the labor neighborhoods, information moving vertically and diagonally in ways she was still mapping 6 weeks in. The ministry building was old stone and courtyard after courtyard, and her office was a room on the second floor with a south-facing window through which she could see a sliver of the palace roof on clear days. The work was harder and more satisfying than she had words for. She sat in meetings with senior officials twice her age who initially addressed her with the elaborate courtesy that functions as condescension, and who gradually dropped the courtesy and the condescension both as it became clear she had no patience for either. She redesigned 2 of the grain allocation systems in her first 3 months and had both approved, not without resistance, but approved. She had 3 direct audiences with the king, which created its own particular atmosphere in the ministry, and which she neither cultivated nor discouraged, simply attending when called and saying what was true and leaving when the matter was resolved. Jason's letters arrived every 2 weeks reliably. They were long letters, detailed accounts of the Eastern Formation's clay profile, updates on the Yoon family. The boys had taken on work as junior weight checkers at the exchange station and were apparently excellent at it, notes on Bomi's latest statements about footwear and tigers. And at the end of each letter, a paragraph that was not about any of those things, that she read carefully and then set aside and then came back to and read again. She wrote back letters of equal length. The distribution of content was similar. He arrived in the capital at the beginning of spring, on a day when the plum trees along the palace road were just starting to open, the blossoms still tight and pale, not yet fully committed to the season. He sent a note ahead, arrived at the time he had specified, and found her waiting at the ministry gate, not because she had been hovering, she told herself, but because she had finished the briefing she was preparing, and it made more sense to wait in the courtyard than in her office. He looked slightly different than she remembered, thinner, maybe, or just more defined, the same direct way of seeing things. He was carrying a cylinder case of documents under one arm, the Eastern Formation report, and when he saw her, he stopped for a moment, and then walked the rest of the way with the measured pace of someone who was being deliberate about not running. "The Eastern Formation," she said. "Confirmed, high grade. The report is complete." He held out the case. "I can leave it with your office." She took the case. Neither of them moved. "Lee sends her love," he said. "Bomi has informed me that tigers are her favorite animals, and she would like a tiger for her birthday. She specified that it must be a real one." "Tell her I'll see what I can arrange," Nina said. She also said that if you're not home for the New Year festival, she's going to send the tiger after you. "I'll be home for the New Year festival." "I told her," he paused. "I also told her I'd try to come." Nina looked at him. The plum blossoms were doing something to the light, softening it, making everything slightly more possible than it had looked a moment ago. "You're staying in the capital," she said, not a question. "My company's correspondent office has offered me a position managing regional sourcing. Based here," he met her eyes. "I've accepted." "Since when?" "Since 2 months ago." "You didn't mention it in your letters." "I wanted to tell you in person," a pause, "so you could see my face when I said it and decide what you thought." Nina looked at him, at the honest, uncomplicated way he was watching her, at the spring light and the plum blossoms and the ministry gate behind her and the city ahead of them. "What I think," she said carefully, "is that we should find somewhere to have tea and you can tell me everything the letters left out." "The letters left quite a lot out," he said. "I know," she said, "so did mine." They were married in Solon village in the autumn, because there was nowhere else it could have happened. Elder Cho performed the ceremony in the communal hall, which had new paper lanterns for the occasion because Lee had decided the old ones were insufficient and had organized the making of new ones with a cheerful and unignorable thoroughness that no one in the village had thought to resist. The Yoon boys served as ushers with enormous seriousness. Old Grandmother Park wore her best coat and wept with great satisfaction throughout. Bomi was the flower girl. She performed this role with authority and considerable improvisation, having decided that the petals provided were not being distributed in an optimal pattern and redesigning the route halfway down the aisle. Nobody stopped her. She arrived at the front looking pleased with herself and stood beside Lee and said, at a carrying volume, "I knew it. I said he was a prince." Lee laughed so hard she had to cover her face. The king sent a gift through Daniel, who attended in person because the king could not and was very proper about it, and also stayed until the Macgioli ran out, which was considerably later than his formal obligations required. The gift was a set of carved ink stones and a note in the king's own handwriting that said, "The grain finds its way to the field." Magistrate Lee Sung-won attended and danced twice with Grandmother Park, both times with more enthusiasm than skill, which Grandmother Park found entirely acceptable. On the evening after the guests had gone, when the lanterns had burned low and the communal hall was quiet, Nina and Jason sat on the step outside and looked at the village. The paddies were dark and full. It had rained this year properly for the first time in 4 years, and the harvest had been the best in memory. In the houses, the lights were warm and steady. From somewhere across the lane came the sound of the Yoon boys arguing about something at a volume that suggested no one was actually upset. Bomi appeared in the doorway behind them in her sleeping clothes, holding the wooden rabbit, having escaped Lee for approximately the 4th time that evening. "I can't sleep," she said. "You haven't tried," Nina said. "I tried for a very long time. It's been 8 minutes. Bomi considered this. Then she climbed into the space between them, arranged herself with the confidence of someone who had been doing this her whole life, and tucked the wooden rabbit under her chin. "Are you happy?" she asked. The question was directed at neither of them specifically and both of them at once, in the way children ask things when they already know the answer and just want to hear it said. Jason looked at Nina over the top of Bomi's head. Nina looked back. "Yes," Nina said. "Yes," Jason said. Bomi nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within 3 minutes she was asleep between them, the wooden rabbit clutched in both hands, her breathing slow and even in the quiet autumn air. The paddies stretched to the tree line, dark and rich, and ready for whatever came next. The river, somewhere beyond the village, moved the way it always moved, not in a straight line, but finding every curve the land offered, patient and unhurried, going exactly where it needed to go.